Well, for more on the situation in Libya, we're now joined live by former British intelligence officer Annie Marchand. She joins us live from Dusseldorf. Ms. Marchand, we're seeing a lot of conflicting voices and inconsistencies from top Western officials during this operation. Why such a tangle?
Well, I think they were tangled as soon as the whole uprising began in Libya because they really didn't know which side to back and which way to jump. Of course, Colonel Gaddafi had been a historic enemy of the West for many, many decades, and suddenly he'd been brought back into the international fold, and there were lots of nice, juicy oil contracts and business contracts flowing out of Libya towards places like the US, the UK, and France and Italy. So I think they were very torn for a long time, and it's only really over the last weekend that they did a bit of a rush job to take the violence to the next stage and protect the rebels that they had been backing secretly for a couple of decades in the east of Libya. So I think different aims from different countries, different vested interests within Libya of the different countries, and also different histories are all playing a part in this muddle. And it is interesting as well looking at the sort of conflicting reports coming out of the UK, particularly about the endgame, where the military chief of defence is saying, absolutely not, we're not going to decapitate the Libyan state, we're not going to try and assassinate Gaddafi. And yet the government is trying to sort of hedge its bets on that front.
How then can this kind of inconsistent command that we're seeing lead to a clean and quick, as we're being promised, operation in Libya?
Well, indeed, I can't see that it will. All they can hope for really is a stalemate and perhaps a partition of the country, unless they want to go down a highly illegal path of trying to assassinate Colonel Gaddafi of Libya. Now, of course, the West has a history of trying to do that, particularly vested interests from the US, the UK and France, who have been at the receiving end of very serious terrorist attacks from Colonel Gaddafi over the last few decades. Of course, there was Lockerbie that struck at UK and US interests, and there was flight UTA 772, which brought down a French airliner in 1989. So I think there's that sort of history is pushing those three, the sort of triumvirate of Western powers, towards a more extreme endgame. But of course the brakes are being put on by the rest of the NATO Council, NATO members and the UN Council. So I can't see how they can come out of this in any sort of winning situation, to be quite frank.
Another pledge from the U.S. Defense Secretary that the intensity of strikes will decrease. We're seeing the opposite. Do you think this is going to go on for quite some time?
Yes, because again, they don't have a clear endgame, and I think the temptation is going to get stronger and stronger, certainly for the West, the UK and France, to try and get rid of Gaddafi in an accident, a bomb that goes off in the wrong place or something. Because, of course, they've made such a problem for themselves now. Even if they end up with a stalemate, a war of attrition, and particularly a partition situation between the East and the West of Libya, then we have a situation where Gaddafi still has power. Now, Gaddafi is going to feel very betrayed by his ex-best allies in the West. Of course, he cozied up to them over the last decade. And Gaddafi has experience and a track record, and also has stated intentions of carrying out terrorist attacks in the future if he stays in power. So I think the West really is in a position where it has to go for the endgame of getting rid of Gaddafi for a regime change. But of course, that is highly illegal under all sorts of international laws and is specifically excluded from the UN resolution.
Let's talk about the Arab League. They're no longer vocal in supporting the operation. Do you think we could see the West lose the Arab world's trust after these strikes?
Absolutely, yes. They're going to be very concerned that it's ongoing, that there appear to be civilian casualties, and they'll be also very concerned about the end game, which is becoming more and more unclear. Also, of course, there has been a history. The people who have tended to have revolted and rebelled against Colonel Gaddafi, a lot of them have been very high-ranking leading members of terrorist organisations like Al-Qaeda. They're associates of this group. And in fact, many of them have been given safe haven in Britain, for example. So we have the West perhaps funding and sending arms through to the royalist rebels in the East, and also to Islamists in the East. And I think that there may be a possibility that the Islamists will gain some sort of supremacy, certainly in the East, and that could sort of tilt the balance of power and be used to create terrorist attacks against the West. And of course that's going to cause yet more concern amongst the Arab League, who are experiencing more stable and more pacific revolutions in other Middle Eastern countries.
Now, if Libya didn't have the largest oil reserves in Africa, do you think there would be so much attention paid to what's happening in the country?
Of course not. No, I mean, we've seen this time and time again, and yet our leaders never seem to learn from history. And I think also the fact that it will be very clear that Libya is being plundered for oil in the coming years, either by the Western triumvirate, if Gaddafi is toppled, or by other countries that have taken more of a back seat in this military intervention in Libya and will be seen more as a friend by Gaddafi if he stays in power. I think, yes, of course, there's going to be more exploitation of the oil and money funneled out of the country and not used to rebuild the shattered infrastructure. So, of course, it's going to be the people that suffer the most in the future.
All right, former intelligence officer for MI5, Anne Machon, thank you very much for that live analysis.